Hi, and welcome back to my channel. Today is going to be a bit of a different episode for me. It is still in the theme of reflections on my life. I just finished reading this book called The Women by Kristin Hannah. And she writes about the nurses in Vietnam. Specifically about this one woman who became a nurse, came from a wealthy family, and her brother died during the war in Vietnam, very shortly after he enlisted. I'm not sure if he enlisted or if he was drafted, because conscription was in effect for the Vietnam War. But she enlisted, and it's about her life in the army. I think it was the army. Regardless, in one of the military agencies, she enlisted and was a nurse and really had her eyes open to the trauma, just the horrible scenes that she experienced. And then when she returned home, had basically no support, because when she sought support from the veterans, she was told that there were no women in Vietnam. So go find help somewhere else, basically. So that made me reflect upon, my recollection of that time period in my life. When the war began in 54, 55, I think there's some controversy over when it actually began. I was only 10 years old, so of course I wasn't thinking about a war. It was really only when I began working and was listening to the news that we all became more aware of what was going on, because in previous wars there really were not the war correspondents reporting back. War was very glamorized in the movies. The Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, all those movies where they were singing and dancing and all the rest of it. The country really didn't have a true picture of what was happening. Now, bear in mind, I am a Canadian. I was living and working in Canada at the time. And a friend of mine, we used to wait at the same bus stop. He was younger than me. I was about 21, I think. He was 18. And he was going to enlist in the American forces to go to war in Vietnam. And as it turns out, that young man never came back, and I can't for the life of me think of his name. That's such a long time ago, 60 years ago in my case. I can't think of his name. But later on, I did work with the draft dodgers, some of the draft dodgers who were employed in the same company as myself. Canada maintained neutrality during that war, although they did provide arms to the United States and permitted them to train in parts of Canada. By that time, I'm thinking, well, I was in my late 20s, I'm thinking about that time. A lot of the young men who were opposed to the war came up to Canada, and obviously immigration was not the same as it is today, because they worked. And I don't know anything about the immigration side of it, but they did work in Canada. And we all saw the horrors through television. I think it was called the First Television War. All the war correspondents that were over there, and although they weren't engaged in battle, you could see what was going on. And I think it was when President Carter came along, Ford was the president at the time when they withdrew troops because Vietnam had succumbed, and the troops are exiting. And President Carter pardoned all the draft dodgers, and they were permitted to come home. I think that's what he did that the first day he was in office. But we moved to the United States in 1996, my husband and I, and we became friends with one of the men that I worked with. Warren was his name. He was in Vietnam and rarely spoke about his time there because, of course, he, like all other men who had gone to war, suffered from PTSD and had other ailments also. He married a woman, Sonia is her name, she's still living. And she was the last one to get on that helicopter to leave Vietnam. So we knew them quite well, and Warren passed away from ailments that were caused by the Vietnam War. And we also had friends when we lived in California. One woman, Susan, her husband died of results of Agent Orange. There were so many men that did. But going back to 96 or 97, I think the Vietnam War Memorial, the wall, was built in 1982, and it was privately funded. There were no government funds. And when we lived in Virginia, my husband and I, we made several trips to the Vietnam Wall. The first we made on our own. And although the city, DC, is a busy, busy city, lots of noise, when you went to walk along that wall, there was silence. You could hear a pin drop. Didn't matter how many people were there. And you would see folks leaving a wreath or a picture or some memento of their fallen brother, friend, relative. It's a feeling it's almost unexplainable, the feeling that you get when you go there. And whenever anyone came to visit us in Virginia, they all wanted to see the wall, so we made several trips there. Part of my youth, I guess. Yeah, sad time in history for Canadians, Americans, and a lot of others. If you get the opportunity, read this book. It is so well written. And although the character is a fictional character, the author did do a lot of research, spoke to nurses, doctors. The woman in this book, she, worked in the emergency operating room and learned as she went along. It was nothing like working at a hospital here in the United States. It's so well written, and she draws you into the character itself. I hope you'll give it a shot. Try reading it.